Fabula Ultima is a tabletop role-playing game by Emanuel Galeto of Need Games, published in 2022. It aims to recreate Japanese console RPGs like Final Fantasy, but gives players and GM the responsibility of creating the specifics of the setting themselves. I'm sure this sort of emulation has been tried many times, and I've certainly seen a few unpublished attempts myself, but this game goes further and deeper than anything I've ever seen. But it does beg the question, does it accomplish the goal of emulating Final Fantasy console-style games? Before I dive in here, I want to point out that this 360-page book is very nicely organized and designed internally. You can see the table of contents here fit nicely on a 2-page spread, and the whole book is really tidy like this. By the way, in this video, I'll just be covering the game rules and character creation in order to give you an idea of how this game works, but it's worth noting that the Game Master section is very well fleshed out, and the bestiary at the end is a really solid launching point for creating any kind of Final Fantasy style enemy you can imagine. This video is brought to you by Vast Grimm Into Oblivion. After being the first TTRPG to crowdfund on GameFound and the first full hack of Morkborg, Vast Grimm aims to introduce its dying universe to Kickstarter fans with expanded rules, additional adventures, and stylish mission patches. Into Oblivion expands on the existing rule set with 3 new books: Blood Altered, a multi-adventure campaign with additional subclasses and monsters, Space Raiders, new classes, factions, and a hex crawl set in a region known as the Graveyard filled with junker ships controlled by a Space Raider faction, and Space Cruisers, which includes starship creation rules, space combat rules, and new factions. Along with the new books, the Vast Grimm Mission Patch program is launching with Punk as Frack patches to adorn your sleeveless denim vest or stitch onto your gaming satchel. The Kickstarter rewards include a free Kickstarter exclusive mission patch for backers in the first 48 hours, 3 48-page hardcover books, 2 header patches, 6 mission patches, a Vast Grimm core book add-on, and a GM screen add-on. Back Vast Grimm Into Oblivion on Kickstarter. The link is in the description. So, I've mentioned Final Fantasy a couple of times already, but this game is also inspired by Bravely Default, Bravely Second, Granblue Fantasy, Ni no Kuni, and Octopath Traveler. But yeah, this game definitely exists within a single genre and tries to reflect the key features of the genre through its rules and characters. If you've played any Final Fantasy or any of those other games, you'll instantly recognize these different thematic touchstones. If you haven't, then you might be in for some really weird bits. From a setting perspective, the author lays out 8 core elements. It's not that every console JRPG has all 8 of these elements, but it certainly feels like they do once you play enough of them. This list of 8 here is just the first of many, many moments in the book where I feel like the essence of JRPGs has been fully and properly captured. As far as the specific world that your table wants to create for the adventure, it could be one of 3 overall motifs. High fantasy, where the locations, the magic, and the villains are all over the top and magical. Natural fantasy, where there's a sense of warmth and community, and the theme is of restoring or protecting nature or the natural world in some way. And finally, techno fantasy, which is the darkest of the 3 motifs. This is more focused on an above and below sort of class division, coupled with the subtext of modern society running roughshod over the natural world. Obviously, your world doesn't have to be just one of these 3 motifs. It could encompass any or all of them. But again, you're really getting a recap here of where JRPGs usually fall in terms of the worlds they exist in. Okay, so here is definitely the most fascinating part of this game right here. Let's see how the rules actually recreate the feel of a console JRPG. One of the first things that jumped out at me is these Game Master scenes. I don't think I've ever seen this before, where the GM just straight up takes the spotlight for a while and acts out or describes what is essentially a cutscene, and the players all just watch. I don't think this is a good or bad thing necessarily. It just kind of depends on if the GM is being entertaining and if it enhances the story being told at the table. One risk I can see here is if the GM injects too many of these and tries to tell their own story. Bonds are a very important part of a PC, where they can list up to 6 people and have up to 3 out of 6 possible emotions in connection with that person. The connection is rated by how many of the out of 3 emotions there are in the connection, and the player can invoke that bond to re-roll. There are 4 core attributes: dexterity, insight, might, and willpower. They are represented by step dice ranging from a d6 up to a d12. When you roll a test or check, you have to combine 2 of these stats. This is reminiscent of Modiphius's 2d20 system, where you're always picking 2 stats and rolling them together, only in this case, it's step dice instead of d20s. Naturally, this can be kind of confusing, especially for the GM who needs to decide on which 2 attributes to roll on any given task. It's a rollover system, so you're trying to roll equal to or more than whatever the difficulty level, or DL, is for the challenge. Spell and weapon damage is often derived from the higher of your 2 rolled dice as well. You get a critical success if both dice match and they are both 6 or higher. A crit is automatically successful and applies an opportunity, which I'll cover in a second. A fumble is anytime both dice show a 1. This is always a failure, and the opposition gets a so-called opportunity. So what's an opportunity? It's an effect that is either in-game or more meta, which will change the situation in some way. I do like this list of possibilities, but I think progress and plot twist both have the chance of being pretty disruptive to a scene, especially plot twist, where a cool scene can get derailed pretty badly if the surprise twist doesn't match the tone and feel of the situation. Just in case you were wondering what the range of difficulty levels are in this game, this table here describes that bit. If in doubt, use 10 as the DL for the challenge. There's a lot of re-rolling in this game. You can invoke a re-roll by calling upon one of your PC's core traits, identity, origin, or theme, and spending a meta point called a Fabula point. You can also get a re-roll by invoking one of your bonds with another character and spending a Fabula point. In both cases, you are expected to actually narrate how that works out in the fiction of the scene at hand. Here's a table showing a number of examples of attribute combos that make up the most frequent checks. I don't know about you, but this is not ideal for quick and easy play. I don't think it's quite as extreme as the 2d20 system in terms of complexity, but it's just the sort of complication that makes for a very hard first couple of sessions for a GM as they work out all the logic of the combinations. The book does generously provide 5 more in-depth examples of what kind of skill checks to make depending on the situation. For example, bringing down a flying dragon would look like this, whereas catching a thief might have a skill check sequence that looks like this. The author gives credit to John Harper and Blades in the Dark for clocks, and discusses them for use in this game several times throughout the book. If you're not familiar, it's a way to put a timer on a scene or even a session in order to levy players against a looming threat. There are lots of nuances here, and they're all well explained in both Harper's Blades in the Dark as well as here. If as a GM you're ever wishing your players would be more decisive and pick up the pace, throw a clock onto the scene. It doesn't matter which game you're playing, clocks work in virtually every RPG I can think of, and they're great. Okay, here's a place in the rules where it really connects with console JRPGs more than with traditional tabletop RPGs. When your characters are in combat, you are never asked to really worry about ranges and distances. Just like in the video game counterparts of this game, combat distance is abstracted, if not completely ignored. Instead, melee and ranged attacks are defined by how they interact with various skills and monster features that are prescribed. This is a pretty big concession that traditional RPG players need to make if they're expecting to have physical combat zone tactics. The actual actions on offer really do present a menu of tactics to consider, though. This is one of those tables that you'd want to print out and hand to each player or send them digitally if you're playing online, since it's the beating heart of combat for this game. I can almost see the little selection arrow that moves up and down this list as the battle music plays. One interesting thing here is how defeated NPCs are handled. When you whittle their HP down to 0, they don't necessarily die, not by a long shot. They could be captured, forced to flee, or merely knocked unconscious. The rules around higher powered NPCs called villains in this game really caught my eye. Quote, when reduced to 0 hit points, a villain must choose one of 2 options, escaping or surrendering. But in order to escape, the GM has to spend one of their meta points called an Ultima point. If the GM doesn't have any more Ultima points, the villain can transform into a bigger, more powerful form, which is about as JRPG as it gets. The book warns you not to overuse this tool, and maybe just do it a few times over an entire campaign. One thing I really appreciated was how PCs can die in this game. You're not automatically expected to rip up your character sheet if you reach 0 HP, but if you do decide to call it on a PC and have them die, and at least 2 of these 3 items are true in the scene, then you can describe a grandiose, self-sacrificing death that completely goes overboard and changes the scene completely. As a player, you need to sort of negotiate what actually happens with the GM, but I really like the spirit of this rule. There are 9 different types of damage in the game that pertain to weapon types as well as resistances. This can get kind of convoluted, but if you're accustomed to D&D levels of crunch, then this shouldn't be too cumbersome. Fabula points are those meta points that players can spend to invoke rerolls and spend on other things. Just like with any meta pool, these points are earned from failures, things like rolling a fumble, villains making an entrance, and surrendering when you reach 0 HP. Aside from invoking a reroll, you can spend Fabula points on certain powerful abilities, as well as something I thought was pretty notable: alter the story. This is like the plot twist thing where, again, everyone is at the mercy of the player doing the altering here. The hope is that everyone at the table is on the same page in terms of the tone and theme of the story being told. But either way, altering the story only costs 1 measly Fabula point. So the game really seems to be leaning in on the collaborative storytelling rather than the GM being the only one in the driver's seat. There's this thing called inventory points where players can have up to 6 at any given time and spend them to suddenly have certain items. In the end, this acts as another meta pool, but specifically for items and gear. And like with any meta point system, the idea is obviously to keep the story going and the players having fun. You don't want a scene grinding to a halt because no one in the party has an item of medium or low rarity. And as far as basic adventuring gear, your characters always have it at all times. The game is abstract in that way, just like in its video game cousins. All casted magic in this game comes in the form of either spells or rituals and subdivided into 6 disciplines. Spells are normally used in combat for offensive or defensive purposes, and you spend from your mind points pool to cast them. If the spell is offensive, you also have to roll a magic check. The book doesn't list all the spells out in one place, unfortunately. They are spread across multiple class descriptions in the character creations section. Unlike spells, rituals are not able to directly harm people or heal or cause status effects. Aside from that, they can be anything you can think of, as defined along this potency and this area table. For rituals, players need to describe what it looks like and what its effect is. So you're not going to get a list of rituals anywhere in the book. Here are some sample rituals for you. Generally, rituals are largely only limited by a player's imagination. Items and equipment, on the other hand, are enumerated at length in the book and accompanied by very nostalgic pixel art. The stat blocks for any given weapon gives its price in zenit, the currency of the world, the skill check you have to roll to see if you land a hit with it, and the damage it delivers if you land the hit. Again, HR stands for the high roll, the higher of the 2 dice that you rolled on the attack check. And after damage is the type of damage that it delivers. Like I mentioned at the top, I'm not really going to cover the world building resources in this game, but it is expected that a table create their world together before starting. This is a nice approach, and I think it can lead to a lot more player buy-in. As far as your player character, you start by defining 3 pillars of their concept. Their identity, which is kind of like their job, but only in the softest narrative sense. These are all familiar roles that cover the gamut of JRPG fantasy. Then you choose your theme, which can be anything, but there are 10 or so suggestions here to color your PC's main motivation for the moment. And finally, your origin, as in your hometown. Where the rubber hits the road is here with classes. You choose either 2 or 3 starting classes out of a list of 15, and you're given 5 levels of progression to divvy amongst the skills of your chosen classes. You start this game at level 5, and the level cap is 50. Another nod to Japanese video game RPGs there, and a real departure from familiar TTRPG territory. What I really like about this multi-classing approach is that your character almost has to be interesting at the start. Instead of starting low and slow with a single class, you can jump into the game with a pretty intense triple class character. Here are some examples of what a starting character could look like when slapping together 2 or 3 classes. There are 4 pages of these examples, so you really don't have to come up with your own starting combination if you don't want to. So the class combinations are pretty cool, but in practice, you will quickly find that about half of the classes are really pretty complex and deep. The ARCANIST, for example, has these specialty skills like every class does, but they also have this whole Arcanum summoning ability, and these Arcana, which are like mystical entities, are enumerated like spells here. Here are the first 3 on the right, and As you can see, each of them has their own mechanics for usage and dismissal, and there are actually a total of 9 of these under the ARCANIST. But the Chimerist just has these 5 skills to choose from, and that's it. The Elementalist has their skills, but also 12 unique spells to choose from as well. So again, you're just going to see a lot of unevenness when it comes to options amongst the 15 classes. All that being said, as long as players put aside enough time to dive in and learn about the character options that they've chosen, there is a massive amount of play variation here. And really, more than anywhere else in the game, you get to realizing that this game is not just a skin-deep tabletop clone of Final Fantasy. It's a substantial role-playing game worthy of a closer look if you appreciate tabletop RPG game design. Like I mentioned, I'm just glossing over the GM section and bestiary in this video, but it's worth noting that the GM section is 80 pages chock full of meaningful advice on how to run this game and how to design encounters, special items, and NPCs. I do wonder how hard it would be for a GM to administer the constant churn of loot that happens in a JRPG. In a video game, picking up and swapping out loot is a huge part of the player experience. But if you're at the table with 3 or 4 other people using pencil and paper, loot management could be incredibly distracting and tedious if people are trying to do it during a session. The bestiary is divided into 8 sections, and each contains what I would consider the most stereotypical or representative monster in each class. You'll notice that the stat blocks are stylistically identical to a Prima guidebook, or one of those video game walkthrough guidebooks. I'm not sure if they still sell those, but they were definitely a part of my JRPG experience back in the day. Another thing you'll notice is the weird sort of monsters here, like the Arcane Lantern or Clatter Clown. If you get it, you get it. And of course here you have the classic guard who is an androgynous 10-year-old. Alright, here are my thoughts on Fabula Ultima. Dual attribute roles. I'm a bit ambivalent about the way you have to combine 2 of the 4 main attributes for every check. It's probably something that the GM gets used to after 2 or 3 sessions, but I think initially it would make for a lot of awkward rules processing. The step dice are great though, and you don't see a lot of crunch in the form of stacked multipliers in this game, so once you can fully internalize the dual attribute roles, things should run fairly smoothly. Villain elasticity. There are a lot of little places in the rules where the game tries to be more like a Japanese console RPG rather than a tabletop RPG, and the GM spending Ultima points to allow a defeated villain to escape is definitely one of them. I just think this might have the potential to really deflate a big player victory if they worked hard to defeat a villain, and the transformation of a villain into a larger, more powerful form also has that same risk, where player victory just segues into an even harder fight. Everything has to be just right for this to work well at the table. GM timing, player willingness, suspension of disbelief, understanding of the genre emulation, etc. Overall JRPG themes and motifs. The author's command of the thematic soul of JRPGs is pretty undeniable. You can see even within the intro chapter that the game has a very firm grasp on the genre, between the 8 pillars and the 3 main motifs for your possible world. But the entire rest of the book also holds on tight to the genre in a way that makes this game the gold standard for TTRPGs trying to do Final Fantasy style JRPGs. And that does sound like a very rarefied subgenre of game, but it does exist, and this one really might be the best attempt to date. Make your own setting at the table. It was the right choice to put the burden of world building in the hands of the GM and players. The alternative would be to prescribe a single fantasy world accompanied by a world map and gazetteer of towns and cities with long, boring descriptions. Instead, you get all the tools to make your own world, and with them, the joy of doing so. I could honestly just play the session 0 of this game and build a world with people at my table and have the time of my life. Mechanics that capture JRPGs. From the personal bonds mechanic, which echoes the interpersonal drama in the video games, to the abstract combat ranges, to the fast and loose basic inventory system, to the ever-evolving villains, this game's actual rules are almost always pointed towards the source material, which is those console RPGs. It all feels pretty refreshing at the same time, which I think is what has drawn so many people to this game already. Artwork and layout, including bestiary. The internal design of this book is pretty much impeccable, with clean 2-page layouts wherever possible and tightly organized chapters. Not a single section seems to overstay its welcome, and yet it still comports a lot of information about a fairly complex game. The artwork does exactly what it intends to do, which is evoke that distinct mix of modern Japanese video game art that you see in RPGs, especially since maybe around Final Fantasy X in 2001. It's all very faithful to the genre. Yeah, so there you have it, a masterfully executed JRPG pen and paper role-playing game. Like I said, I've seen a number of attempts at this kind of game, usually fan-made stuff that people publish for free in a Word document or something, but none of those hold a candle to this one. This is the complete experience from top to bottom, and it came seemingly out of nowhere. I'd love to know what your experience is with this game and what your thoughts are on its design, organization, and artwork. If you would like to keep this channel going, please consider joining my Patreon. I've left links for this game as well as how you can support the channel down below. Thanks for watching. See ya.